I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. It's back to school time across the country, and that also means back to homeschool for the 2.5 million homeschooled students in America. The Colson Center has always been a strong supporter of homeschooling. We're often a part of homeschool events around the country, both as speakers and as exhibitors. In this episode of the BreakPoint podcast, we bring you a recent speech by Colson Center President John Stonestreet to the Great Homeschool Convention held this spring in Napierville, Illinois. His topic is what it means to be human. In this talk, John helps us understand how humans are unique among all of God's creations, because we're made in the image and likeness of God.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction, Dan, and thank you for that warm welcome. I've got to say, of all the welcomes I've ever had, that one by far is the most recent, so thank you. It is, we're going to talk about culture, and Dan, as Dan mentioned, the most important thing about me, and if we can get the slides up here, the most important thing about me is that I'm the dad of 4 kids and a husband of 1 wife, and I'll show you a picture of them. But we're going to, in just a second, but we're going to talk about culture. I am the president of an organization called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. How many of you guys have heard of Chuck Colson? Does that name ring a bell? Well, Chuck Colson was one of the great Christian leaders of the last generation, known for his work in the prisons, but also known as a voice to the church about what was happening in culture. And that part of Chuck's legacy is something that we carry on at the Colson Center through a daily commentary that you can hear on podcast or on through your email or on radio called BreakPoint. And our goal is to help Christians think clearly about the culture. And so that's why I spend a whole lot of time looking at what's happening in the world and trying to figure out what are the implications for people of faith. How do we understand what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview? And so I care about culture not only because I run a cultural organization, but because I care about the church. And we've got to think about the culture in order to do our job as the church well. You can find us at this website here, breakpoint.org. And today's talk, I'm going to talk specifically about 4 major ways that culture has changed in the last few decades that make our job as parents a little bit more difficult or challenging. As was mentioned, this is my family here. This is my wife, Sarah, on the right. We have 3 daughters. Abigail's 14. Anna is 12. And Allie, who's with me, sitting back there somewhere. Where are you, Allie? She's waving. She's 10 years old. She's traveling with me this weekend. We're having a good time. And we had 3 daughters, and we're good and thought we were done. And do you know what my daughters did? They prayed for 6 years that God would give them a little brother. And they won. So that little boy right there, and the picture there in the right corner is Hunter Blair. That's his name. He's 2 years old. He showed up 2 years ago, and that's him in his happy place, Chick-fil-A. Anybody else have a happy place, Chick-fil-A? Yes, me too. So anyway, Hunter and I were at breakfast. We love having a little boy in our home now, and I think we're okay because I hear, we already have 3 girls, and I hear having girls is harder than having boys. Is that true? I mean, it makes sense because if you have a little boy, you just got to worry about one little boy. But if you have a little girl, you got to worry about all the little boys in the world, right? But I want my kids, like all of you, I want my kids to know God through Jesus Christ. I want them to obey God. I want them to trust God. I want them to have an eternal relationship with God that begins this side of eternity and lasts forever. That's what I want for them. And helping our kids, introducing our kids to right thinking about God would be difficult enough if there were no other factors, if there were no other cultural forces in play. If all we had to deal with was their own independent thinking and their own sin nature, our job would be hard enough. I learned this really early. I remember I was traveling when my oldest daughter was just probably 3 years old. And I was on the road, and my wife told me that as she was putting the 2 girls that we had at the time to bed, Abigail leaned in on the way out of the room and looked at her little sister, who was just 1 at the time, and looked at her little sister and said, "God will be with you tonight, Anna. God will be with you." Which was super sweet. But then she turned around to my wife and said, "Mommy, I told Anna that God would be with her, and the other God will be with me." And I thought, oh no, I work for Chuck Colson and my daughter's a polytheist. Like, how did this even happen? But if all we had to deal with was just their own thinking, this would be a challenging enough job. But here's what we're trying to help folks with is that we're not dealing with our own kids, thinking and their hearts and the condition of their hearts in a vacuum. We're doing it in a context of a culture that also provides all kinds of pressure in their lives. And you could try to keep the culture out, and I think there's some wisdom in trying to keep part of the culture out, but you know what? You can't ultimately keep the culture out. We're pretty conservative in what we kind of watch and listen to in our home. But man, I remember 5 or 6 years ago on a Saturday morning, I was flipping pancakes for my kids, and my wife put on a praise CD, and the song that came on was 10,000 Reasons. You know that song, right? By Chris, 10,000 Reasons. Bless the Lord, oh my soul. And out of nowhere, my middle daughter pops up. Hey, Daddy, is that Justin Bieber? I was like, what? Where did you even hear Justin Bieber's name? We've never had a Justin Bieber song play in our house. So we spanked her, and I'm just kidding, we didn't do that. But it's this amazing thing where you can try to keep the culture out, but it's really difficult. And so about 2 years ago, my friend Brett Kunkel and I dove in because of how significantly and how drastically things have changed in our culture just over the last 10 years or so. And we wrote a book called A Practical Guide to Culture. If you ask my friend Brett why he wrote this book, he'll tell you he has 5 reasons. You ask me, I'll tell you I have 4 reasons. My 4 reasons are those 4 kiddos up there. His 5 reasons are his 5 kids. Is anybody else just a little bit dizzy about how quickly things went from unthinkable to unquestionable just kind of overnight? Does anybody else kind of think like I do at some times that you're like, man, why God did you put my kids in this time and in this place, in this culture? Why couldn't they have been born in the good old days? I have no idea when they were, but I read about them. They sound great. Why couldn't they be back then? Anybody else struggle with this? Yeah. And so then we read, as Dan mentioned, in Acts chapter 17, when Paul is speaking to the Athenians on Mars Hill, and he says that God determines the exact times that people live in the boundaries of their dwelling place. So let me just begin by saying this. It is no accident that our kids are in this cultural moment and not in another. God wanted them here. And he didn't want them here to be a victim of the culture. He didn't want them here to just barely survive the culture. That huge vision, and I'm going to be talking about this in some of my workshops over the next couple of days, this huge vision of what it looks like for the church to courageously champion the cause of Christ in this cultural moment is the vision that God has for our kids, not in another time, not in another place, but in this time and in this place. But at some level, we've got to understand what's going on. And that's really what I want to talk to you about. In our book, we use an analogy that culture is a lot like water. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. Now, why wouldn't you ask the fish? I asked a group of high schoolers that a couple years ago. They're like, I don't know, because fish can't talk. I was like, no, because fish don't know they're wet. Right? Fish don't know any other environment. They don't know what water is because they don't have any sense of what anything else is. Culture is a lot like water. Or another way to put it is, what water is to fish, our culture is to us. We swim in it. And sometimes it's such a normal part of our lives, we don't think about the way that it's pressuring us. In our book, we talk about water on 2 levels. First of all, we talk about the cultural waves. If you've ever been to the beach and you got hit by a rogue wave, you know it, you felt it, you sensed it. Has that ever happened to anyone? Sure. Now, the thing is sometimes culture hits you with waves. Does anybody feel like culture's hit us from about 5 different directions in the last 10 years? Yeah. And so we actually talk about very specific issues that many of us feel because it's a real part of our world and we've seen the change. For example, all the letters of the acronym LGBTQIA. We talk about those in the book. We talk about the epidemic of pornography, which has now been identified by even another state as a public health crisis because you know what? It is. We talk about the addiction, the opioid epidemic and the a tragedy of addiction that we have. And by the way, addiction goes beyond just addiction to narcotics or to drugs. We could talk about addiction to video games, which researchers now say addiction to video games is very similar to an addiction to controlled substances. We could talk about, in the book, we also talk about the racial tension that we have in America, because that's something that's been a very real part of our experience throughout our history, but even just recently as well. We talk about all self-harm issues. There's a suicide epidemic. In my state of Colorado, suicide is the second leading cause of teenage death. And we're the second leading state for teen suicides in America. And so you talk about all of these cultural waves, you feel them, you sense them, you need to know what to do with them, and we address those in the book. But we also have another section, and this is what I want to talk about with you today. Have you ever been at the beach and you've just gotten your chair settled, your kids go and run and jump in the water, you look up, you see them, and then you start fiddling around, maybe you check your phone or something, you look back up expecting them to be where they just were, and instead of being there, they're not there. Has that ever happened to anyone? And you panic, and so what you do is you look down the beach 20 yards this way or 20 yards this way, and there you find them. How did they get 20 yards down the beach? Well, it wasn't because they walked. It wasn't because they swam. It wasn't because a wave hit them and took them there. They just ended up there. It wasn't a wave. What took them there? An undercurrent. And just like the ocean has waves and undercurrents, culture has waves and undercurrents. And I'll tell you this, some of these undercurrents, we don't even sense that they've taken us anywhere. We don't even know that they've done something to us. But let me make this statement. Culture is most powerful, not where it's the loudest, but where it's the quietest. Culture is most powerful in our own thinking, in our own lives, in our own hearts, not where it's the noisiest, but here it is, ready? Where it makes things seem just normal. And this is one of the things we have to understand. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. One of the best C.S. Lewis quotes that I know of is this one, in which he said that the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones being argued, but the ones that are assumed. And that's true, and I talked about this yesterday when I talked about entertainment. That's true when it comes to movies and music and memes and things like that. That a lot of times in our culture, we don't have arguments about ideas. Ideas get smuggled into our imaginations through what we watch, what we listen to, and that sort of thing. So we always have to have our brains on. If I could paraphrase this just a little bit, the most dangerous issues in our culture are not the ones that hit us out of nowhere. They're the ones that subtly and quietly take us to a new place, like an undercurrent. And I want to talk this morning about 4 ways that our culture has dramatically shifted in the last several decades to the point that it's just a normal part of reality for people today, especially if you haven't lived through the transition. If all you think is this is normal because this is life and so on, this is a dramatic change in the life of our culture. Here's the first one, the first big cultural undercurrent. I'll call it this. The drowning of truth in noise. The drowning of truth in noise. When historians and sociologists look at different periods of history, they give them names. So if you're a student of history at all, you've read about the Enlightenment, or you've read about the French Revolution, or you've read about the Age of Exploration, or something like that, the Industrial Age. Well, guess what? Our culture forever has already been named. So 150 years ago, 150 years from now, if we're still here, and people are writing history books about our time and period of history, it's already got a name, the Information Age. Why is it called the Information Age? Because we live in a culture where on an average daily basis, someone encounters more information than someone in the 1200s or the 1400s or even the 1800s would have seen during their entire life. We live in the age of information. It is a dramatic change. One of the writers that I appreciate the most and most disagree with is a guy at the New York Times named Thomas Friedman. Thomas Friedman, several years ago, wrote a book that was really interesting called The World is Flat. Has anybody read The World is Flat? Did you read that book? Can I put you on the... Can you kind of... What's The World is Flat about? Do you remember? I know, it's one thing to read a book, it's another thing to remember it. I apologize. Yeah, and a lot of distinctions become flattened out. Yeah, and it's a fascinating book. What Friedman was arguing is look, we're entering a new phase where the things that have divided the haves and the have-nots, right, and developing nations and developed nations in particular, right, which was access to resources and that sort of stuff, as information becomes widely available through the internet, the world's flattening out. It's becoming more accessible to everyone, and it's going to change. It was a really interesting book. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot again. Do you remember where or what year he wrote that book? I know, that's really unfair, isn't it? Here it is, 2006. 2006. Now, why is that important? Because last year, Thomas Friedman, or 2 years ago, Thomas Friedman wrote another book called Thanks for Being Late. If you haven't seen it, read it yet, you'll enjoy it. The first chapter of that book is titled, What Happened in 2007? Is anybody here enough of a techie nerd to know what happened in 2007? The iPhone. What else? The Android. What else? Basically the era of the smartphone. What else? Facebook became public. What else? Twitter. What else? Skype became a thing. What else? There was an advancement in fiber optic technology that made international communication instantaneous. What else? About 7 other things that he writes about that I couldn't even understand. You say, John, what's your point? My point is that Thomas Friedman wrote The World is Flat in 2006, talking about how information was changing the world. 2007 will go down in history like the year of the printing press. Most of your kids don't remember life before 2007. To them, this new era of smartphones and information and technology is not unusual. It's not, wow, how things have changed. It's just normal. And we need to understand how dramatic this is. If you've ever read, for example, back in history about the Industrial Revolution, you're reading about this time where industry and manufacturing became such a big part of culture that it literally changed everything. We went from being an agrarian society to being an industrial society. And that meant that work went from being in the home to being in factories. That meant education changed. That meant how we do church changed. That meant how we do laws and the sort of laws that we need to govern ourselves. All of that changed. You look back about the Industrial Revolution, and it was not just about industry. It was a massive shift across all of civilization. My point is that same level of a shift from an agrarian to an industrial society is happening right now. We're just shifting from an industrial society to an information society. And as dramatic and as vast as that was, will be as dramatic and vast as this shift is as well. Now, what do we mean? What do we mean when we say it's a dramatic shift? Well, here's one of the things. In an age of information, ideas suddenly become radically available. Another way to say it is the age of information is the age of competing ideas. I used to go speak to youth groups a lot, and one of the things that I would often do is I would actually pretend to be an atheist. It's called the atheist role play. I used to do this. Sometimes I would actually have the youth pastor not even introduce me, and I'd come up and basically start challenging the kids' faith. And you say, why would you do something like that? Well, 2 reasons. Number one is it brings up a lot of the questions that people are going to face when they go to college, and I wanted to go ahead and address some of those questions. And number 2 is that it allowed me to use my sin nature for a good cause. So that's what I would do. And I remember, one time I was at this one Christian school and I went after these kids and we were having a really good discussion, I thought. But then right after my session was lunch and the Bible teacher came up to me and he was really, really mad at me. And he said, I can't believe you did that. I said, what do you mean? He said, I can't believe you pretended to be an atheist. I said, well, what's the problem? And by the way, his kids really struggled with why we know the Bible is reliable. Okay, so that's when, as the conversation went, sometimes it goes to the problem of evil. Sometimes it goes over here. This one really went to the reliability of the Bible. And his kids just really didn't know. And he goes, now I'm going to have to spend an entire week teaching the kids why the Bible can be trusted. And he said that like he was grumpy at me. And I remember thinking, I'm glad you know that you should teach that now than after they go to college and lose their faith, right? Anyway, here what was interesting is when I was playing that role play with this group of students, and this was probably 15 years ago, I was bringing to them information that they had never encountered. I was bringing them arguments about the reliability of Scripture that they had never seen. The big difference between students 15 years ago and students today is that when I bring arguments about why the Bible can't be trusted, they've already heard those arguments because they've seen them online. They've already encountered those arguments. You see, an age of information is an age of competing ideas. But that brings up something else. The age of information, the age of competing ideas, brings up a big question. In fact, I'm convinced that one of the great questions of this generation that's driven by this massive undercurrent of this shift to being an information age is this one. Who do I trust? Because the age of information is an age of competing ideas, and that immediately makes it an age of competing authorities. Friedman didn't talk about this as much in the book, but one of the ways the world has flattened is with with authorities. Anybody with a blog, anybody with a meme, anybody with a social media presence can throw an idea out as if they're an authority. And so one of the great questions is, who do I trust? Do I trust my parent or do I trust my professor? Do I trust my pastor or do I trust my peer? Or do I just forget all of them and Google it? Right? So now we have a trustworthy, an issue of trust. Who do I trust? Who's trustworthy in the whole deal? But there's one more thing too. One more thing that is changed in our hearts and minds by living in the world of information. And here it is. Living in a world of information gives us the impression that access to information is the same thing as wisdom. Knowing an answer that we can find digitally is a poor substitute for knowing how to live well. One of my favorite authors from a previous generation is T.S. Eliot, who apparently looked a little bit like Herman Munster, but he has this remarkable little poem called Choruses from the Rock, and here's what he writes. And it would be hard to describe the setting of this thing, but it's just a fascinating observation. Listen to what he said. He said, the endless cycle of idea and action, endless invention, endless experiment brings knowledge of motion but not of stillness, knowledge of speech but not of silence, knowledge of words and ignorance of the word, capital T, capital W. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. All our ignorance brings us nearer to death. But nearness to death, no nearer to God. Where is the life we've lost in living? Where is the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information? He wrote that in 1934. And that's one of the things that happens in an age of information, is that we start confusing this brand new access that we have to all kinds of information, all kinds of knowledge. Fix it yourself, do it yourself, and all that sort of stuff. We can Google it, we can YouTube it, we can find the answers that we want immediately, and it makes a very poor substitute for knowing how to live well and acquiring actual wisdom. So what's the antidote? In our book, we not only talk about these four undercurrents, we also give antidotes. And I can't give you all the antidotes that we talk about for each of these trends, but I'm going to give you the big one for this one. The antidote for living in an age of information is discernment. Now, I know as educators, we often use this mantra. We teach kids how to think, not what to think. Listen, for most of us, unfortunately, that's just a mantra. How important is discernment? How important is it that we teach kids how to think? Here it is. In an age of information, kids that do not develop discernment are destined to be deceived. In an age of information, kids that do not develop discernment are destined to be deceived. Even the Apostle Paul, in his prayer for the church at Philippi, in the first chapter of that epistle, Philippians, he actually prays this. He prays that their love would abound more and more in truth and in all discernment. Because some of us think, well, listen, there's so many bad ideas out there. There's so many false sources out there. The thing we have to do is give our kids the truth. Yes, you need to give your kids the truth. But please understand this. If your strategy is just to dump true information into an ocean of information, what's going to happen to the truth? It's going to get drowned out. It's going to get lost. I hate to say this to you, and I'm not just saying it to you, I'm saying it to me too. The reality is, as different as parents are, as important as parents are, in a very important sense, you and I are one stop on the information bus of the week. And there's a lot of stops. Now, our stop is the most important stop. There's no question about it. But what happens at our stop has to be different than what happens at all the other stops. We can't just be dumping information into their heads. We need to help them develop discernment.
I hope you're enjoying today's BreakPoint podcast. Before we return to John Stonestreet's talk, What It Means to Be Human, I wanted to let you know that many of the ideas John is discussing here are explained in even more depth in Os Guinness's new book, Carpe Diem Redeemed, Seizing the Day, Discerning the Times. Os Guinness explains what it means to be fully human, fully alive, and fully engaged in the culture. You can get Os Guinness's new book by going to breakpoint.org and making a donation of any size to BreakPoint and the Colson Center. Again, that's breakpoint.org. Now, let's get back to John Stonestreet's talk, What It Means to Be Human.
In our book, not only do we have an antidote for each of these cultural trends, we have strategies. We wanted this book to be, as it says, a practical guide to culture. And so let me give you a strategy for teaching discernment. This is something that you can start today. You can take it out of your back pocket and use it immediately. And it's a lesson, a strategic lesson that we can learn from the two greatest educators in history. Who do you think the two greatest educators in history were? Well, Jesus has to be one of them because we're at a Christian conference. That's right. There's Jesus, right? I don't know what the question is, but Jesus is the answer. That's right. Jesus is one of them. Any guesses who the second might be? And some of you might fight with me on this one, but I'll just say Socrates, okay? Now, Jesus and Socrates didn't have a lot in common, right? They saw the world very differently, but they both did something really well. When someone came to them with a question, instead of just giving them answers, they were really good at asking good questions. And I think that a fantastic strategy for developing discernment in the next generation is to ask questions. We have a whole list of questions. These are like plug and play questions for almost any scenario. I'll get through as many as I can here, but I'm going to at least spend a little bit of time on the first one. I think this is the most important thing that you can put in your back pocket and use to develop discernment, okay? Have you ever been in a conversation? By the way, the question is, what do you mean by that? Now, let me tell you what I mean by, what do you mean by that? Have you ever been in a conversation with someone, and midway through the conversation, you realize we're using the same vocabulary, but we're not using the same dictionary? Has that ever happened? I had a conversation like this on a flight from Colorado Springs to Atlanta. I sat down next to this lady, and she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I work for a Christian organization here in town." And she cocked her head back at me and said, "I'm an atheist, prove me wrong." We weren't even off the ground yet. And we got into a 3-hour conversation. And by a 3-hour conversation, I mean a 3-hour fight. Now, I know what you're thinking. You can't fight about these things on airplanes. And my answer is, if they want to fight, yes, you can. No, I'm just kidding. After about 30 minutes, we were actually going at it pretty good. And after about 30 minutes, I stopped and I said, "Hey, you know what? I really enjoy these conversations, but I'm really weird. And I don't want to ruin your day. Like, are you okay? I don't want to, make you uncomfortable or anything. Do you want to go to sleep or pretend like you're going to sleep so you don't have to talk to me? Like, it won't offend me at all." And she looked back at me. She's like, "Are you kidding? I'm having a great time. Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, okay, back to it." So that's what we did. Every 30 minutes, we'd stop fighting and check on each other, and then we went back to it. But right off the bat, this woman looked at me and she said, "How can you believe in God?" Now, I had been to seminary. I had learned the 5 classical proofs for God's existence. I'd even understood the difference between the various forms of the cosmological argument. So I was armed. But someone had taught me this strategy, and I'm really happy that they had. Because this woman said, "Why do you believe in God?" And instead of just going into my answers, I said, "Well, wait a minute, what do you mean by God?" You know how she answered it? She said, "A grumpy old man with a beard in the sky who can't wait for you to do something wrong so he can strike you dead with a lightning bolt." I was like, "Lady, I don't believe in Zeus." But do you realize, had I just jumped into my answers, I would have been defending a God that I don't actually believe in. You see what I mean? And it started this great conversation. Now listen, that's just one example. Can I give you 4 or 5 words whenever you hear them? These are specifically important words for this cultural moment. Whenever you hear these words, you need to throw out this question: what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Certainly God is one of them. Because God has been moved. The power of living in a secular culture has not been to disprove God. It's been ready to privatize God. So God is not understood as an entity that exists outside of ourselves. God is not understood as being either objectively existent or not. God has been reduced down to our personal private friend. And if you have him, that's true for you. And if you have him, that's true for you. And so listen, that's not God. The essence of idolatry, T.S. Eliot said, A.W. Tozer said, is entertaining thoughts about God that aren't worthy of him. So many people believe in God, but they're worshiping a false idol. So God's one of them. Here's another one. This might be the most important other than God. It's the word love. I am a huge fan of C.S. Lewis. Lewis once said that for every new book, read 3 old ones. I say for every new book, read 3 C.S. Lewis books. And one of the books of his, in fact, I think this might be his most important book. As much as I love Narnia, as much as I think Mere Christianity is helpful in a skeptical culture, his most important book for this cultural moment might be The 4 Loves. Because in our culture, whenever love is used, it's typically used in this way, either to mean a strong emotion or to mean something sensual. Either emotion or sensuality. Right? So that's what it means. So you think about that, and whenever love is used, that's when that's basically how it's used. Neither one of those are any of the actual words that mean love, at least how we translated them in the scripture. The Bible gives us 4 different concepts. Everything from sacrificial love to brotherly love. Brotherly love is never talked about in our culture, which is why we don't have strong male friendships between people. Confucius said, when words lose their meaning, people lose their lives. Chesterton said, if words aren't worth fighting for, what on earth would be? You better believe it when my daughters come to me and say, Daddy, I love that boy. The first question is going to be, what do you mean by love? The second question is going to be, what do you mean by boy, and where is he? Here's another word that whenever you hear this used, you got to ask, what do you mean by that? The word freedom. See, the word freedom in our culture means freedom from any constraints, freedom from any consequences, essentially a free for all. Freedom means no boundaries and anything like that. That's what we mean by freedom. And it's a terrible definition of freedom. Here's how we know. I don't know how you actually measure this, but many sociologists have over the last couple of years. And I've seen studies and reports on these studies several times that we are the most addicted generation that's ever lived. I mean, we're addicted to everything. We're addicted to sex, we're addicted to drugs, we're addicted to each other, we're addicted to our smartphones, we're addicted to video games, we're addicted to chocolate, we're addicted to coffee. That one's okay, that one's mine. We're addicted. Now, if you're addicted, are you free? No, you're actually what? You're actually a slave. You're a slave of that thing. If our definition of freedom makes us slaves, that should tell us we have a wrong definition of freedom. And by the way, freedom itself is a very tricky thing that we need to understand. Os Guinness puts it this way in his book of Free People's Suicide, is that the greatest enemy of freedom is actually freedom. Because when freedom becomes a free-for-all, we become slaves to our own addictions and our own passions, and then we lose that freedom. Does that make sense? He talks about this in this book, and it's very interesting. We often talk about how, people fight for our freedom and Americans won their freedom. And he rightly says, look, winning freedom is not unusual throughout history. It's not common, but it's also not unusual. Many people have won their freedom. What's really unusual is not winning freedom. What's really unusual is keeping freedom. And I'll give you a hint. A proper definition of freedom is not doing whatever you want. That's only true if there's no such thing as a design in the world. But if there is a design in the world, we're not free by doing whatever we want. We're most free when we are who we were created to be. This is huge in a culture that not only wants to free us from constraints, free us from consequences, free us from accountability. We live in a culture that thinks we can be freed from reality. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk about how to talk about sexuality to your kids. And I'm not going to get into details right now, but this is a really important one. This isn't the same birds and bees talk that your parents had with you, because we live in a culture that's calling men mothers. We have to rethink this. And a lot of it has to do with our bad definition of freedom. Of course, another word that you should always ask, what do you mean by that, is the word truth. Because truth in our culture doesn't mean truth. Truth in our culture means preference. It's not whatever it corresponds with reality. It's whatever is true for you. Well, there's some other questions we talk about in the book, and you can find those. We have 5 or 6 there. I was going to give you these this morning, and it was going to change your life, but I'm out of time. So, hey, another resource that's available to you that can help you develop discernment with your kids, and this is completely free. How many of you guys remember Chuck Colson's BreakPoint commentaries? It's a daily commentary on faith and culture that's done on the radio and through podcasts and through email. Since Chuck passed away, Eric Metaxas and I have picked that up. And so we talk every single day about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview. We also have some other content. If you're a podcast person, just look up BreakPoint on your podcast, and it's a great way to have a conversation with your kids. It's really interesting. I have parents come up to me all the time, and they say, you're part of our family. And I say, that's really weird. What do you mean? And they'll say, well, for our dinner time conversation, we print out your BreakPoint commentary and we read it around the table. And what you say, well, what do you guys talk about on BreakPoint? Well, we might talk about politics. We might talk about the arts. We might talk about the International Persecuted Church. We might talk about cultural trends. We might talk about this, that, or the other. That's what BreakPoint is really all about. Well, let me give you the second a second cultural shift that has taken place. And that is what I'm going to call being alone together. Being alone together. I get this phrase from a woman who has worked for 30 years as a psychiatrist at MIT. Now put that together. She's studying human behavior at MIT, where they're doing all of this technology. And she's written books. Her first book was written back in the 80s. And she's been writing for 30 years about how computers are intersecting with our lives and how they're changing who we are. And her first book was written back in the 80s. Does anybody remember computers in the 80s? Yeah, they were essentially ginormous calculators, right? Well, back in the 80s, what Sherry Turkle said, and by the way, her last name is Turkle. It's like turtle, but with a K. You can find her 2 TED Talks online, which I know it's an ironic thing to recommend here as we're talking about technology. But her first book in the 80s basically predicted that the computer was quickly becoming not just a place where we would go and do calculations, but it would eventually become a place where we go live. She wrote that in the 80s. That was before Al Gore gave us the internet. Her second book was in the 90s. This was after the internet, but before social media. This was when basically it was the era of chat rooms. And in her second book, she made a second prediction. Not just that the computer is a place where we went and lived, which had already come true, but it would be a place where we go and explore alternative selves. She was a postmodernist in her understanding of identity. So she thought it was great. I remember reading this book in seminary, and she said, I think it's great that a disenfranchised, lonely, isolated 65-year-old man can go on the internet and be whoever he wants and be accepted, even if he wants to be an 18-year-old woman. She didn't write her third book till 2011. And I saw her third book, and it was really profound. So I asked her to come on our podcast. And the first thing that I asked her is, hey, listen, one of the things that I noticed about this third book is that your tone has changed. She said, what do you mean? I said, you used to be so optimistic about how culture was going to change and the difference that it was going to make and so on and so on and so on. And now you look at technology and all that optimism is gone. What happened? She said, John, I just wasn't prescient. I just didn't see the negatives. I said, yeah, but what changed your mind? She goes, I don't know. Maybe it's because I have a teenage daughter. And the title of her third book is this right here, Alone Together. And just like in the first book, she made a prediction. Just like in the second book, she made a prediction. In her third book, she makes another prediction. After watching how people interact now with all of this ever-present technology, or as my friend puts it, always glowing rectangles everywhere. That the prediction she has made is that we are quickly becoming a culture that will have to choose between real relationships and digital mediated relationships. And one of the things she talks a lot about are artificial companion robots. Now, I know this sounds crazy. This is the part of the talk where I go, this is crazy. But you think about it, how much more have you heard about artificial intelligence just in the last 6 months to a year? There was an opening monologue on a television show a couple years ago where this guy a couple months ago where this guy began his show by going, you know what? Do you realize how much time we spend proving to robots that we're not robots? Do you know what I'm saying? Every time you go on a new web page, right? It asks you, are you a... You're talking to a robot. But you think about Siri and you think about Alexa and you think about all the other things that we have. You also think about the plummeting birth rates around the West, including the United States. We're now for the second straight year below replacement rate. When you talk about Europe and you talk about Asia, now you're talking about a driving demand for an artificial companion. I know you guys are looking at me like I'm crazy. I agree. This sounds crazy. But think about how we're being catechized to deal with real people. And you tell me what our future generations going to choose. Are they going to choose a real human for a spouse that they have to deal with every single day? Or is the prospect of coming home and your machine meets you at the door and it looks like a person? And by the way, they never age. They always look exactly like you want them to. And not only that, but this computer being thing looks at you and goes, how was your day? And you can pour out your hearts to them and they will listen and give you empathy. And you never have to listen about their day. This is a real challenge. An age of ever-present technology is an age where we don't know how to relate to real people. So this is going to be simple, but the antidote for living in this cultural trend is just relationships. I know some of you are like, well, that's too easy. I know I used to live in Tennessee, and there should be this old guy at my church, and he would go, hey, man, it ain't rocket surgery. And I agree. This isn't all that moving. But what do we mean by relationship? First of all, we have to have time. Time. And can I add uninterrupted time? So often these digital glowing rectangles are interrupting our time with other people. Here's a huge one, eye contact. Eye contact. Employers tell us that the next generation doesn't know how to look people in the eye. They don't know actually how to read nonverbal communication. And this is a crucial skill in dealing with real people. This is a suggestion from Sherry Turkle herself. I don't think that she's a believer. She seems to be kind of a spiritual kind of person, but I don't think she's a Christian from any indication that I had. But this was her language, sacred spaces. She basically says you have to budget times when there will not be interruptions from technology. And she lists 4. The first one is the car. The car, you have a captive audience. The car, you have all kinds of things around you to talk about. But how often in the car are we interrupted by technology? Second place, and this is in my mind the most important place, the dinner table. The number one indicator of a child's long-term success, and nothing else even comes close, is that they're raised in a home with married mom and dad. Of those raised in a home with married mom and dad, the second leading indicator of a child's long-term success is they have meals together. But even families now that have meals together, there's the TV on in that room, dad's checking his phone over here, kids are texting instead of talking, and that sort of thing, uninterrupted time. So she says the dinner table. The third place is the bedroom. Now let me just say this definitively, ready? It's insane. And by this, I mean it's crazy in the worst possible way. It's idiotic. I'm just going to say that very carefully. To give students, especially middle schoolers and high schoolers, unfettered, unaccountable access to the internet in the privacy of their bedroom. It is insane. And it's not because necessarily your kids are looking for porn. It's because porn's looking for your kids. I'm going to talk about this tomorrow morning, about living in a sexually saturated culture and preparing your kids for the very good gift from God sex is in such a tough environment. But listen, it's crazy. But it's interesting to me that Sherry Turkle not only talks about the predatory nature of pornography in our culture in that part of the book, she also talks about this, that one of the bedrooms that needs to be tech-free is the bedroom with mom and dad. It's like how much intimacy, physical and emotional and spiritual intimacy is lost because when all the kids are down and it's just the two of you again, dad's on his device, mom's on her device, and there's not any intimacy that's taking place. And the fourth place, she said the car, the dinner table, the bedroom, and the final one is a scheduled day or a scheduled time, a holiday, a room, something like that. I'll tell you how we've done it in our family. I read a book several months ago that really just impacted me, written by a friend. The book is called 24/6. It's on basically re-embracing the Sabbath. And see what happens is culture puts you on a rhythm. And that rhythm is interrupted or driven by and large by these devices. And so every Sunday, in fact, from Saturday night to Sunday night, from Saturday dinner to Sunday dinner, we become a device-free home. Now, it's hard. We haven't batted 1,000 since we started this. But I tell you what, it is wonderful to go to church on Sunday morning after not looking at a device for 12 hours before. And it's great to be with family together. And it's just kind of re-embracing that rhythm of the Sabbath. All right, let me go to the third. There's more things that we could talk about, books and so on. Let me go to the third one here. And that is, the third big trend is called perpetual adolescence. I need to pick up the pace here. Perpetual adolescence. What do we mean by perpetual adolescence? I came across this idea in a book by a woman named Diane West, and the book was entitled The Death of the Grown-Up. And the opening line of that book is really fascinating. Here's what she wrote. She wrote, there was a time, literally, when there were no teenagers. Now, she's not talking about a time when there was no one teenaged. She's just talking about that throughout most of human history, in most cultures around the world, being a teenager wasn't a thing. Being a kid was a thing, and being an adult was a thing, and transitioning from a kid to an adult was a thing, but being a teenager wasn't a thing. That it's really a late 20th century human innovation of the West. In fact, she blames it on Chubby Checker. You remember Chubby Checker? What was he known for? The twist. You say, well, what difference does that make? Well, prior to the twist, kids went to the adult dances, dressed like the adults, and danced like the adults. Chubby Checker gave teenagers their own dance. And then there was the automobile revolution, and so you didn't even have parents going to the dance. Kids drove themselves to their own dance. And then there was a group of people called advertisers who realized there was all kinds of money to be made off this particular segment of the population, and poof, there was the birth of the teenager. But it really isn't something in reality like gravity. It's more of a social innovation. It doesn't actually exist in reality. Being a child exists, being an adult exists, but being a teenager is a made-up stage. Now, certainly, there's some neurological studies that have been done about the teenage brain that look about, how is the teenage brain not fully developed? And one particular part of the brain that hasn't been fully developed in a teenager is the risk part, the one that helps you kind of measure causes and effects and that sort of stuff. But in most cultures, they would treat kids like adults, and so those connections would be made. We live in a culture where we treat teenagers like kids, and so therefore the connections are never made. But there's been something else about this. Not only do we have a stage of life called adolescence, but here's the point. Kids enter it earlier and earlier and earlier. We introduce them things that steal their innocence, and then we never ask them to leave adolescence at the end. That's why I call it perpetual adolescence. You can see this in the movies. I grew up in the golden age of cinema, the 80s. Do you remember the knuckleheads in the movies in the 80s? Ferris Bueller, Marty McFly. They were teenagers. And then I went to college in the 90s, and then I realized, all the knuckleheads in the movies were now in college. Adam Sandler, Chris Farley, things like that. Now you get to today and look at the movies around you. Look at these series like The Hangover and Bad Moms and things like that. And who are the knuckleheads? Who are the ones acting like teenagers? They're the married with kids crowd. In fact, most sociologists no longer identify the teenage years as 13 to 18. Do you know what the official definition of adolescence is now? 11 to 30. 11 to 30. It's amazing. Now you say, well, what's the antidote to that? Here it is. One of the problems with a culture that embraces perpetual adolescence is, ready? We penalize the next generation with low expectations. We expect little of them, we get little of them. So what's the antidote? The antidote is high expectations. In my next workshop, which is going to be, I think, about 1 o'clock this afternoon, I'm going to go into this point at a whole new level. And the reason is because sometimes as Christian parents trying to react to a culture that's so crazy like ours, we actually have low expectations when it comes to their behavior. In other words, our expectations are nothing higher than please conform to my standards, which gives them a really difficult transition when they're outside of your home. Higher expectations are not conform to my standards. Higher expectations are become a person of character and virtue. And in that workshop, we're going to talk about how right answers aren't the same thing as virtue. And how do we cultivate and develop virtue in the next generation? So that's high expectations. That's the strategy for that one. I'm just running out of time here, so I want to push through this. Again, I'll come back to that in that workshop. Okay, final point, final big trend. And this is also, I have to tell you, this is might be on a broad perspective the most significant. I call it identity after Christianity. Let me tell you what I mean. Many of us look at what's changed in our culture, the waves, all the letters of the acronym LGBTQIA, the sexual so-called liberation, pornography, addictions to substances, and that sort of stuff. And here's what we're tempted to think. We're tempted to think that the changes that have taken place in our society have been fundamentally moral changes. In other words, that things that were once considered wrong are now considered right, and things that were once considered right are now considered wrong. Now, that's observably true. There's no question that things that were once considered wrong are now considered right and vice versa. But if you think that's the story, you're misunderstanding it. What I mean is the moral changes that have taken place in our society have been the fruit of the problem, not the root of the problem. They're the effect, not the cause. Beneath the moral changes that have taken place is a much more dramatic fundamental change. And it's a huge change. It's not just a change in behavior. It's a change in how we understand what it means to be human. It's not a moral shift. The moral changes have been the fruit of a deeper, and these are big words, anthropological shift. And what we mean by anthropological shift is we live in a culture that no longer knows what humans are and what humans are for. If you look at every single major social issue that we face, from sexuality to abortion to doctor-assisted suicide, which just passed in Maine yesterday, to the addiction issue, to fashion and what we think beautiful is, to suicide, to all self-harm, to the race issue, you can actually go across the spectrum of the culture, and each and every one of those issues are rooted in a deeper misunderstanding of what it means to be human. I want to point you to a passage of Scripture, Psalm 135. In Psalm 135, David tells us the root of our identity crisis. David says that those who make idols and those who worship idols become like them. God has made us such a way that we see ourselves and we see other people in the image of whatever it is that we worship. And we are a nation of idolatry. It's so deeply embedded. I know we don't carve blocks of wood with ears on it and then talk to it like other generations. And we look at that and say, how quaint and how silly. We're so much more sophisticated. Do we have gods in our culture? You bet. In fact, at the Colson Center, we do frequent online short courses. And our next short course launches this Tuesday. You can actually still sign up for it. It's almost full, but you can sign up for it if you'd like. And we're going to talk about the 4 big idols of our generation. And because I used to be Baptist, they all start with the same letter. The 4 big idols, 4 things that are good things in and of themselves, but have taken the place of God in our culture: state, stuff, sex, and science. I could go through all four and tell you how they take the place of God, and we're going to talk about that. But my point here today is because we have false gods, we have untethered ourselves from the thing in whose image we're made. So because we don't know what to worship, we don't know who we are. It's kind of like we're a culture using a compass that always points at us. Anybody here like to go hiking? I mean like really hiking, like get lost in the woods and get out with a compass hiking? Yeah. A compass works. Why? Not because a compass tells you which way to go. You don't just follow the arrow. The compass always points at something fixed and unchanging, right? The North Pole. So let's say we sent you out in the wilderness and we gave you a compass, and everywhere you turned, that compass pointed at you. There was no fixed reference point. You would be if you're the North Pole, you're always lost. And because we've lost a fixed reference point, one of the big conclusions has been we've lost what it means to be human. And you have to understand this on a macro level because God has chosen to put you in the 21st century. The 20th century was the first century in which we consciously tried to build the world on consciously atheistic worldviews like Marxism and fascism and so on. We took God from being the truth about the world. Darwin gave kind of the nail in the coffin, and we became a godless world in very many ways. The 21st century is the consequence of the 20th century. In the 20th century, we lost sight of God. In the 21st century, we no longer know what it means to be human.
That was Colson Center President John Stonestreet speaking at a recent Great Homeschool Convention event in Napierville, Illinois. His topic was, What It Means to Be Human. Before we go, I've got a couple of updates from the Colson Center I think you'll find helpful. First, we've gotten a great response from our free What Would You Say video series. These videos ask and answer tough questions. Questions like, when does life begin? What is gender identity? And doesn't love make a family? We're posting a new video every week, so don't miss a single new episode. Just go to whatwouldyousay.org to see the first 4 videos in the series. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe to the weekly emails that will announce a new video release each Wednesday. Also, this reminder, during the month of September, the Colson Center is offering that great new book by Os Guinness called Carpe Diem Redeemed, Seizing the Day, Discerning the Times. Os Guinness is one of the leading Christian thinkers of our time, and he's been a longtime friend of the Colson Center. His latest book won't be available to the public for several more weeks, but it's available to Colson Center supporters now. It's a call for Christians to live consequential lives in a harried and distracted world. Carpe Diem Redeemed, Seizing the Day, Discerning the Times, is available at BreakPoint.org with any donation you make to BreakPoint and the Colson Center. Again, that's BreakPoint.org. Finally, be sure to join us again on Wednesday for Part 5 of our special series by Britt Hume, Robert George, and Chuck Colson, entitled Doing the Right Thing, an Exploration of Ethics. Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint podcast. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.